Hi everyone, tonight we're going to step straight into the foggy cobblestone alleys of Georgian London, where gas lamps flicker in the mist, carriage wheels rattle on the stones, and shadows slide across every brick wall. It's a city pulsing with noise, but also with secrets. And one of those secrets, one that ruined countless lives, was the quiet, poisonous comfort of laudanum. Now, I have to warn you, if you were alive back then and you slipped into this world, you probably wouldn't survive it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time where you are right now in the comments. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The first time I saw laudanum wasn't in some dark alley or hushed apothecary, but right in my neighbor's parlor, where the curtains were drawn too tight and the air smelled faintly of vinegar. She was a thin woman, a mother of 3, and her bottle sat casually beside the sugar bowl, like it was just another condiment for tea. That's the thing. Laudanum wasn't a sinister contraband whispered about in fear. It was as normal as bread, eggs, or the morning sermon. Apothecaries sold it in neat glass bottles labeled in delicate handwriting. And if you had enough pennies, no one asked you a single question. I used to think of it as a doctor's little helper, something you'd take for a cough or a restless child. But here's the kicker. Laudanum was basically opium dissolved in alcohol. A knockout punch in a tiny bottle. They called it a panacea. But honestly, if you needed to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak, it would happily do the job, at least until it turned on you. I remember stepping into an apothecary for the first time. The shelves lined with dusty glass jars, each with faded Latin scribbles. It was like walking into a miniature museum, except the relics were alive and ready to mess you up. The man behind the counter, a wiry figure with ink-stained fingers, sold powders, tinctures, and bombs as if they were sweets for children. He offered me a sample of laudanum in a spoon. Just a drop or two. My tongue tingled, my body softened, and suddenly London's chaos dimmed like someone had muffled the city itself. That was my first taste of oblivion. And I'll admit it, I wanted more. The irony is, everyone thought of laudanum as medicine, but I quickly learned it was less about healing and more about numbing. People drank it not to live better, but to live quieter, in a city of endless clatter, where every corner had a beggar, every street had a brawl, and every room had a draft. That kind of silence was seductive. There's an old saying my grandmother liked to repeat: medicine in small doses heals, in large doses kills. I used to roll my eyes at her wisdom, the way kids do, but after laudanum, that phrase wasn't a proverb, it was a prophecy. I'll give you a quirky little fact here, because you deserve one. Did you know that in Georgian London, cats were sometimes rented out to taverns to control the rat population? People would literally pay to borrow a cat for the night. Imagine that. Here I was, slipping toward addiction, while someone else was negotiating the hourly rate of a tabby. And while that seems funny, it's also connected. You see, the city itself was like one giant tavern crawling with problems. And laudanum was the cat, temporary, convenient, but never a real solution. Even scholars argue about this stuff. In the academic debate sense, laudanum sits at the intersection of medicine and poison. Was it the miracle cure of its time, or just a mass experiment on unsuspecting bodies? Some argue it helped thousands through pain that had no other relief, while others say it crippled generations. Personally, I think both camps have a point. For me, it started as relief, but it didn't take long for the scales to tip. One night, after a particularly long shift hauling crates down by the docks, I sat in my rented room with a bottle in hand. I poured a teaspoon into my tea, stirred it gently, and drank. The room tilted slightly, but in the best way, as if gravity had been adjusted just for me. The ache in my muscles faded, the loneliness in my chest dissolved, and the city's endless growl quieted down to a whisper. For once, I felt almost noble, like the world was letting me sit still, granting me peace. But peace, as I would learn, isn't free. Every drop came with a hidden debt, one I'd be paying for in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Still, in those early days, I didn't see the trap. All I saw was a golden liquid that turned misery into music. And in a city as harsh as Georgian London, wasn't that worth it? The days after that first taste blurred together. And not just because of the fog that clung to London like a damp blanket. No, it was because laudanum had started to tug at the edges of my hours, pulling them loose like threads from a worn coat. I'd wake late, groggy but calm, and the world seemed softer, like someone had sanded down the sharp corners. For a man living in a single damp room above a fishmonger, with rats scratching at the floorboards and the smell of brine creeping into my dreams, that softness felt like a gift. I convinced myself I was using it responsibly. That's always the first lie, isn't it? Just a teaspoon here, a few drops there. I told myself it wasn't like gambling away your wages at the alehouse or stumbling drunk in the street. I was in control. Besides, the apothecary himself said it was medicine, sold it with the same smile he gave to mothers buying cough syrups for their babies. If it was dangerous, surely someone would have warned me. Spoiler alert, they didn't. And here's something wild. Old-time physicians genuinely believed laudanum could cure nearly anything. Toothaches, menstrual cramps, broken bones, even melancholy. It was the Swiss Army knife of medicine. Though, let's be honest, most people didn't use a Swiss Army knife to fix their souls. But try telling that to Londoners in 1800. One evening, I wandered into a coffee house, the kind buzzing with smoke and political chatter. Men in wigs leaned over pamphlets, debating Parliament, while others argued about the price of sugar. Me? I slipped a few drops of laudanum into my coffee under the table. No one noticed, and why would they? Everyone had their vice. Some gambled, some drank gin, and me, I had my little amber secret. The warmth spread through me, and suddenly the debates around me seemed comical. One man was red in the face, shouting about tariffs, while another wagged his finger like a metronome. I chuckled out loud, earning a glare, and muttered to myself, "Gentlemen, you're arguing about pennies while I found paradise in a teacup." Yeah, that didn't win me friends. It was then I realized laudanum didn't just numb pain, it made the world absurd. The dirt on the street, the sweat of the dock hands, the stench of the Thames, it all melted into background noise, like static on a broken radio. And honestly, that's addictive in a way no one warns you about. There's an old bit of wisdom I once heard from a sailor. The sea doesn't drown you all at once. It creeps up your ankles first. Laudanum was exactly that. It didn't slam me with disaster, it crept in, ankle deep, knee deep, until I didn't notice I was sinking. And while we're creeping off topic for a second, did you know pineapples were such a rare luxury in Georgian London that people actually rented them to show off at parties? Guests would admire them like they were diamonds, but no one dared eat them. Imagine that. Borrowing a pineapple just for clout. Meanwhile, I was borrowing peace of mind from a bottle I couldn't afford to own forever. Academically speaking, because I do like to sound clever sometimes, the historians call this the paradox of progress. Medicine advanced, but society hadn't caught up with the consequences. Laudanum was progress, sure, but without the knowledge of addiction. It was like handing a child a loaded pistol and calling it a toy. Still, back then, I didn't see paradoxes. I only saw how laudanum painted the world with softer colors. One rainy afternoon, I stood at my window, watching umbrellas bob down the street, their owners hurrying like ants. Normally, I'd feel bitter, cursing the cold drizzle leaking through my roof. But that day, with laudanum swirling in my veins, the raindrops looked like diamonds falling from the heavens. I even laughed at myself, whispering, "Congratulations, you've turned poverty into poetry." But poetry doesn't fill your belly. And the cost of those bottles began to gnaw at me. They weren't cheap, not on a laborer's wages. I started cutting meals short, pawning off little things, always promising myself I'd stop when it got serious. Spoiler alert number 2, it was already serious. And yet, each night I returned to the bottle, like a moth circling a flame. I wasn't chasing euphoria anymore. No, I was chasing silence. The kind that smothered the hunger in my stomach and the loneliness rattling around in my chest. Georgian London was a loud city, but inside that laudanum haze, I could finally hear myself breathe. What I didn't realize was that the city itself was watching. Quietly. The apothecaries, the doctors, even the neighbors, they all saw men and women like me slipping under. But no one said a word, because if they admitted laudanum was dangerous, they'd have to admit the whole system was broken. And who wants to start that argument? So there I was. One hand clutching a bottle, the other fumbling to keep up appearances, sinking inch by inch into the warm, deceptive waters of oblivion. By the time weeks had passed, laudanum wasn't a novelty anymore, it was a companion. Not a loud, demanding friend like gin, not a rowdy one like ale. No, laudanum was the quiet confidant who whispered, "I've got you, don't worry." And I believed it, foolishly. I believed it. Each morning, I'd wake with my mouth dry as chalk and my body aching as though I'd been beaten in my sleep. My first thought wasn't food or work, but the bottle. Just a sip, just a drop, just enough to set my bones straight again. And sure enough, it worked. The aches loosened, the headache lifted, and I could face another day on the cobblestones. London in those years was a city of masks. People strutted about in wigs and lace, pretending at wealth even when their pockets were hollow. I suppose I wore a mask too. Outwardly, I was just another laborer, mud on my boots, calluses on my hands. Inwardly, I was already bargaining with myself every hour. One more dose and then I'll cut back. One more tonight and tomorrow I'll be clean. You can guess how that went. There's a scrap of old wisdom that floated around dockside taverns. A man can quit anything but breathing. They meant tobacco, gambling, women, drink, whatever your poison was. I laughed at it then. But as laudanum wove its hooks deeper into me, I realized it wasn't just a joke. It was the truest academic thesis any drunk sailor ever muttered into his pint. I'll give you a quirky diversion here, because the heaviness needs a break. Did you know that in Georgian times, men sometimes carried little boxes of fake beauty marks, stick-on patches, to cover pox scars or just to flirt? Imagine slapping a heart-shaped sticker on your cheek and calling it charm. Honestly, compared to my situation, pasting polka dots on your face seems like a pretty harmless vice. But back to the bottle. The cost was climbing, and so was my dependence. I started skipping shifts at the docks, making excuses about fevers or pulled muscles. The truth was, I couldn't lift a crate without first steadying my trembling hands with a sip. And once you're unreliable in that kind of work, the foreman notices. One morning, he cornered me near the pier, his voice sharp as a gull's cry. "You look half dead, lad. You drinking too much gin?" I wanted to laugh. If only it were gin. Gin was honest. You drank it. You staggered. You slept. Laudanum was sly. It made you look calm, even polite, while hollowing you out like a carpenter's drill. Just tired. Sir, I lied. My words smoother than they had any right to be. Laudanum gave me that, a silver tongue, even when my insides were crumbling. That night, lying on my cot, I thought about the debate raging silently across London. Some swore laudanum was a gift of science, a mercy in a brutal world. Others whispered that it was the devil in disguise, turning good men into shadows. If I'd been asked then, I'd have said both were true. Laudanum was mercy when I wanted to forget, and damnation when I remembered too much. I suppose every addict has that one moment when they realize they're no longer in control. Mine came quietly. I was at the apothecary, coins sweaty in my palm, when he looked at me with something like pity. He didn't refuse me, didn't warn me, didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply handed over the bottle. And in that silence, I knew he saw what I was. And he decided it wasn't his business to stop me. That realization should have scared me. Instead, I shrugged it off with a bitter little joke to myself. Well, if the doctor's selling the poison, it must be safe. That's the kind of humor laudanum leaves you with, dry, sarcastic, and a little bit cruel. But in the dim light of my room, with the bottle warm in my hand, I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't drinking for pleasure. I wasn't drinking for relief. I was drinking because without it, I was nothing but a shivering husk, waiting for the city to grind me down. And still, even knowing all that, I uncorked it. The sweet, bitter taste slid down my throat. And once again, the world softened. For a moment, I was safe. For a moment, I could pretend the debt wasn't mounting. For a moment, I could breathe. The real trouble started when my body began demanding laudanum before my mind could even argue. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart hammering like a blacksmith's forge, and my hand would grope blindly across the floorboards for the bottle. Half asleep, half panicked, I'd swallow a mouthful just to quiet the storm inside me. Only then could I drift back into the kind of shallow, uneasy sleep that felt more like drowning with my eyes closed. London doesn't forgive weakness, and it certainly doesn't forgive lateness. I began showing up late to the docks, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling. The foreman noticed, the men noticed, and soon I wasn't being offered as many shifts. Less work meant less pay, and less pay meant fewer bottles. It was a vicious circle, a snake eating its own tail. And I was in the middle of it, chewing myself to pieces. Now, if you ask the old philosophers, they'll tell you, habit is second nature. I used to think that meant little things, like brushing your boots or saying grace before supper. But standing in line at the apothecary, the same coins ready in my palm, the same weak smile plastered on my face, I realized habit isn't just second nature, it becomes your only nature. Everything else falls away. Here's your quirky fact for this section. In Georgian London, people actually believed that carrots could cure almost anything. They were fed to horses for strength, to children for better eyesight, and sometimes even used as poultices on wounds. I suppose if someone had handed me a carrot instead of laudanum, I'd have laughed, though honestly, chewing a carrot might have been safer in the long run. One particularly bleak morning, I found myself wandering through Covent Garden, pockets nearly empty, head pounding like drums. I told myself I'd just walk, distract myself, breathe the air, but the smell of bread from the bakeries only reminded me I hadn't eaten. The chatter of merchants felt like hammers inside my skull. The only thing that seemed to promise relief was the thought of that little amber bottle. So I pawned my boots. Just imagine that, a grown man, barefoot on filthy London streets, trading leather for liquid. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so pitiful. Each step home, I could feel the stones biting into my feet. But the weight of the bottle in my pocket was enough to make me believe I'd made the right choice. There's something scholars like to call the economy of desperation. It's the study of how poor souls barter dignity for survival. I never thought I'd be an example in that debate. But there I was, padding through puddles with bare feet, defending my trade with a twisted kind of logic. Boots wear out, but laudanum gives relief. Of course, I knew deep down it was madness. But madness with reasoning is still madness. That night, I sat with the bottle, staring at my swollen, blistered feet. I almost laughed at the sight, muttering, "At least you're lighter without the boots." A weak joke, but in the haze, it felt like wit. That's laudanum for you. It doesn't just numb your body. It numbs your pride until you think your ruin is comedy. And yet, I clung to it. The city outside my window howled with noise, the cries of hawkers, the rattling of carts, the endless barking of dogs. But inside my little room, after a long sip, all was quiet, peace, at the price of everything else. The creeping ankle-deep water of addiction was now at my chest, and I could feel myself sinking further. But still, Even as I drowned, I reached for another drop. Another night of silence. It wasn't long before the neighbors began whispering. You know how it goes. Walls in London are thin, and gossip is cheaper than bread. They noticed I rarely left my room except to fetch bottles. Noticed the way my steps faltered on the stairs. Noticed the hollow look in my eyes. Some muttered that I'd taken to the gin. Others thought I'd caught some wasting disease. No one guessed the truth. Laudanum didn't have the spectacle of gin's staggering walk or ale's roaring laughter. It was a quieter destruction. One that left you pale, polite, and empty. One evening, Mrs. Turner, the widow downstairs, knocked at my door with a bowl of stew. You're looking thin as a rake, she said, her voice a mix of kindness and suspicion. I thanked her, forced a smile, and promised I'd eat every drop. Truth? I only managed half. My stomach twisted at the thought of food. Yet the bottle on my shelf made my mouth water like a starving man staring at a feast. It struck me then, how bizarre it was. Trading meals for medicine, trading strength for stillness. There's an old saying I once heard, hunger sharpens wit, but drugs dull it. I laughed bitterly, thinking, so what does that make me? A witless skeleton in the making? Here's your offbeat fact to lighten the weight. During Georgian times, people actually kept hedgehogs in their kitchens to eat insects that crawled near the pantry. Imagine a prickly little guard dog patrolling your bread supply. Meanwhile, I had no hedgehog, no bread, and not much left worth guarding. Around this time, London itself began to feel unreal, like a stage set I could step on and off at will. The fog rolling off the Thames seemed thicker, the lamplight dimmer, the cobblestones beneath my feet uneven in ways that made me stumble. Was it the city shifting, or just my perception through the amber haze? I couldn't tell anymore. And yet, here's where the academic debate sharpens. Was laudanum my captor, or my savior? Without it, I shook and sweated, gripped by pain so sharp I thought my bones might crack. With it, I could at least walk, talk, even laugh occasionally. Historians argue whether addicts like me were victims of the drug or of the society that offered it so freely. Honestly, both sound right. Society handed me the poison with a smile, and I drank it willingly, almost gratefully. But London was no gentle host. The more time I spent indoors, the less work I had, and the less money came my way. I started pawning more than boots, shirts, blankets, even my father's old pocket watch, the one heirloom I'd sworn never to part with. Each item sold bought me another week of oblivion, and each sale carved a little more out of my soul. One rainy night, I stumbled out of the apothecary with my purchase clutched close, only to slip on the slick stones and crash into a beggar. He looked up at me, rain dripping from his beard, and said, "At least you've got shoes." For a moment, I wanted to laugh at the cruel irony. I had shoes again, borrowed ones, too big and worn thin. But his words hid deeper than the fall. He was starving for food. I was starving for peace. And we were both begging in our own ways. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at my dwindling possessions. The stew Mrs. Turner had given me was still sitting cold on the table, untouched. My stomach growled, but my hand reached, as always, for the bottle. And as the warmth spread through me, I whispered to no one, "I'll quit tomorrow." Tomorrow, of course, never came. The first time I tried to stop, I thought it would be easy. Foolish, isn't it? I told myself I'd go one day without laudanum, just one. I even hid the bottle in a drawer, locked it, and tossed the key out the window into the gutter. That morning, I strutted about like a man making a noble stand, proud of my willpower. By noon, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift a spoon. My skin itched like ants crawling under it, and my thoughts raced in jagged, unfinished sentences. The world was too loud, the creak of floorboards, the dripping of a leaky pipe, even the whisper of the wind against the glass. Every sound felt like a hammer striking my skull. By evening, I was on the floor, sweating through my shirt, clutching my knees to my chest. My body begged for the drug, and my mind screamed insults at me for denying it. I remember rocking back and forth, muttering nonsense, convinced I'd hear voices if I listened too hard. That was the longest night of my life. And when morning came, I was crawling on my hands and knees, searching the gutter outside for the key I'd thrown away. There's an old piece of wisdom. Chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. I never understood it until I was lying face down in a muddy gutter, digging with bare fingers for a key to my own prison. For a moment of comic relief, because you need it after that picture, did you know Georgians believed powdered mummies could cure ailments? Yes, actual ground-up mummies imported from Egypt. Apothecaries sold it as medicine, and people swallowed it without blinking. Imagine me there, shaking and sweating, thinking, and I thought carrots as medicine was absurd. The academic debate on laudanum always circles back to this question. Is it the user's weakness, or the drug's power, that drives addiction? I used to think I was weak, but after that night, I leaned toward the other side. It wasn't just weakness. It was warfare. Laudanum didn't knock politely. It broke down the door and set fire to the house. When I finally uncorked that bottle, the relief hit so hard I nearly wept. My hands stilled, my thoughts slowed, and the world returned to its hazy softness. But here's the cruel joke. The dose I took wasn't enough. The more I consumed, the less it seemed to work. A teaspoon became a tablespoon, and a tablespoon became 2. My tolerance grew faster than my purse could keep up. One Sunday, I even sat in church. Yes, I still tried to attend sometimes, with laudanum hidden in a flask under my coat. The preacher thundered about sin and salvation, and there I was, sneaking sips like a thief. When he spoke of hellfire, I nearly laughed aloud. Hell, I thought, wasn't in the next life, it was right there, in the pews, sweating and shaking until I swallowed enough firewater to silence the demons inside. As I stumbled home, I passed children skipping rope in the street, their laughter sharp and bright. It cut me to the bone. Once, I'd laughed like that. Once, I'd been a boy who thought the world was wide open. Now, the world had narrowed down to the width of a bottle's neck. That night, I promised myself again I'd stop, after just one more drop. Always one more, always tomorrow. The one more drop rule became the law of my life. Every plan, every promise, every faint glimmer of discipline crumbled before it. If someone asked me to help them haul sacks at the docks, I'd say, of course, after one more drop. If I told myself I'd pay the rent on time, it was, yes, but after one more drop, everything became conditional, balanced on that amber liquid. Mrs. Turner, the widow downstairs, grew bolder in her concern. One afternoon she stopped me on the stairs, her hands folded over her apron, her eyes narrowed. "You're fading away," she said. "There's sickness in you." I laughed it off, though my ribs pressed sharp against my shirt, and I could feel my skin hanging loose on my bones. I muttered something about long hours and poor food, and she frowned, muttering about how men always thought themselves stronger than they were. Old wisdom rings true here. The body keeps score, even when the mind cheats. My mind lied daily, telling me I was fine, telling me I was in control, but my body wrote the truth across my skin, trembling hands, hollow cheeks, and eyes that no longer sparkled but sank. Here's a strange, light-hearted fact to balance the weight. In Georgian London, it was fashionable for wealthy men to keep squirrels as pets. They'd even carry them around in little cages or on leashes, parading them like jewels. Can you imagine a man in a powdered wig, strutting with a squirrel on his shoulder? Sometimes I think London was addicted to absurdity as much as I was addicted to laudanum. But beneath the absurdity, I knew something was rotting. One evening, I tried to work without a dose. Just once, I thought, I'll see if I can manage. My hands shook so violently I dropped a crate, and the foreman cursed me, saying I was drunk. Drunk. I almost wished it was only gin. Gin doesn't hollow your bones from the inside out. Gin doesn't turn you into a polite ghost who smiles while dying. The academics would argue, still do. I imagine that laudanum blurred the line between medicine and poison. But for me, the line wasn't blurred, it was erased. There was no longer medicine in that bottle. Only necessity. Without it, I was half dead. With it, I was half alive. Either way, only half. One night, sitting in my room with my last half bottle, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. At first, I thought it was someone else. Hollow eyes, gaunt face, shoulders hunched like a beggar's. I actually whispered, "Who are you?" And the silence that answered back was heavier than any sermon. I laughed then, because what else could I do? A brittle laugh, cracked and thin, like dry wood snapping. I told myself a joke. At least mirrors don't charge rent. But the laugh didn't stick. The silence returned, and I filled it, as always, with another drop. London had a way of swallowing men whole. Not with violence, not always with hunger, but with its sheer weight of living. The markets clattered, the churches tolled, the carriages thundered by in mud and muck, and I drifted through it like a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead. Laudanum gave me just enough lightness to float, and just enough heaviness to sink. The docks had no patience for ghosts. One morning, I stumbled late to my shift, the bottle tucked inside my coat. The foreman, red-faced and bristling like a bulldog, barked, "You're no use, Turner." He never bothered with my real name, just some half-heard version. I tried to steady my hands on the rope, but the fibers bit into my palms and my knees buckled. The rope slipped, a crate cracked open, and sugar spilled like snow into the mud. The foreman shouted until spittle dotted his beard. Old wisdom says, a man's worth is measured by the steadiness of his hands. If that was true, I had no worth left at all. My hands trembled even when I wasn't moving, as though the marrow inside them was rattling loose. And here's a curious aside, in Georgian times, there was a craze for pineapples. People didn't always eat them, they rented them. Yes, you heard me. They'd pay to display a pineapple at a dinner party, just to show off. Then they'd return it to the merchant. Imagine that. A fruit passed around like a trophy. It makes you wonder if vanity itself was another kind of drug. I kept working as long as I could, because money meant more laudanum. But one afternoon, I collapsed, not from exhaustion alone, but from absence. I had miscalculated my dose, too little, and suddenly the air thickened. My chest clenched, and the world spun in frantic circles. The other men jeered, saying I was drunk, and one even nudged me with his boot. Only Mrs. Turner came, pushing through the rough crowd, her hands surprisingly strong as she helped me up. Later, she pressed a bowl of thin soup into my hands and whispered, "You'll die in that bottle." She smelled of starch and onion, her eyes sharp as pins. I almost wanted to believe her kindness was enough. But the bottle in my pocket was warmer than the soup. I chose the warmth. The scholars of medicine would phrase it differently. Dependency compromises agency. But I didn't need their debate. I knew the truth. I didn't own the bottle anymore. The bottle owned me. That night, as I sat alone, the wind rattling the window frame, I realized I was afraid of sleep. Sleep meant silence, and silence meant listening to the body's protests. I whispered, "Just one more drop," and tipped it back. It burned less than gin, but it carried far greater fire. I dreamed of London burning, not with flames, but with bottles glowing in every window. Thousands of us swallowing the city whole. I began to notice the city in fragments, as though my eyes were only willing to open halfway. The cobblestones gleamed after rain, but I saw only puddles to avoid. The grand houses loomed behind iron gates, but all I thought of was whether their servants carried laudanum bottles in their aprons. London had shrunk to a scavenger hunt for my poison, and everything else blurred around it. One morning, I woke to find my rent overdue notice shoved under the door. The ink already smudged from someone's wet boot. Mrs. Turner upstairs had tried to cover for me once or twice, but her patience thinned like her purse. She warned, The landlord doesn't keep men for charity. I mumbled my thanks, clutching my bottle like a rosary. The old saying goes, even a drowning man clings to thorns. That was me, scraping for pennies, pawning what little I owned, holding tight to something that tore me even as it saved me. Here's a lighter absurdity to set against the weight. Londoners once believed tomatoes were poisonous. They'd grow them as ornamental curiosities but never dare eat them. Imagine, whole gardens of food turned to decoration, while half the city starved. Humanity has always had a talent for choosing the wrong poison. My health soured more quickly than my fortunes. My teeth ached, my gums bled, and my skin broke into patches that looked like old parchment. When I caught sight of myself in a puddle, I didn't think, man. I thought, specimen. The kind of figure scholars would one day argue over. Was he sick with disease? Or merely with vice? Work finally ended for me after another collapse. This one more dramatic than the last. I had been lifting barrels. Or trying to. When my legs buckled and I went down flat. The foreman shouted that I was a danger. And 2 men dragged me like a sack of coal to the gate. That was the end of my wages. My routine. And what little stability I'd had. With no work, I turned to odd tricks. I begged in corners, traded favors, even told fortunes with playing cards to passing sailors. Sometimes they gave me coins, sometimes they gave me nothing but a kick. Still, every shilling fed the bottle. The academics might call this stage total dependency. They'd phrase it coldly. Perhaps. The subject demonstrates a pattern of maladaptive coping. But I didn't need their words. I was living proof, shuffling proof, empty-eyed proof. One night, as I lay in my cot with the wind shrieking down the chimney, I whispered, tomorrow will be different, but even my own voice didn't believe me. The next morning, the first thing I did was uncork the bottle. And so London shrank further still. Not a city. Not even a neighborhood, just a bottle. Always, the bottle. By the time winter set in, I was no longer a man moving through London. I was a shadow drifting at its edges. My room grew colder, my clothes thinner, and the bottle always lighter than I wanted it to be. Hunger scratched at me, but laudanum muffled its claws. I could go without bread for 2 days, but never without a sip of that amber dream. Mrs. Turner tried once more. She found me slumped on the stairs, half asleep, half shivering. She shook me gently and said, "This isn't living, love, this is waiting for the grave." Her words pierced, though only for a moment. The old wisdom says, truth is medicine, but medicine stings before it heals. I felt the sting, but not the healing. My cure still lay in the bottom of the bottle. Odd fact, during those same years, Londoners feared walking under ladders, not for superstition alone, but because chamber pots often emptied overhead. You'd be safer walking into the street than ducking beneath scaffolding. Imagine the smell. I thought of it sometimes when I felt the sour reek of my own unwashed body. I had become my own chamber pot, carrying filth inside, spilling it slowly over time. Work was gone, rent was unpaid, and soon the landlord threatened eviction. I tried to argue, but my voice shook and broke like a worn fiddle string. He sneered, called me a soaked rat, and promised to change the locks. I laughed bitterly, though not at him, at myself. A soaked rat at least can swim. I could only sink. The academics, if they'd been watching, might have noted. The subject exhibits marked social decline. How polite their words would seem compared to the reality, me. Coughing in an alley, begging for coins with a bottle-shaped bulge in my coat. One evening, with no money left, I sold my boots, walked barefoot on the frozen cobbles, toes red and raw, just to afford another vial. When the apothecary handed it over, his eyes flicked down at my feet, then away quickly. Even pity was too costly to spend on me. Back in my room, I rocked myself in the chair, bottle in hand, whispering nonsense rhymes to no one at all. A drop for the king, a drop for the clown, a drop for the man who can't lie down. I laughed, And the sound startled me. It was high, cracked, like a child's. If there was a bottom to the bottle, I had not yet found it, but I knew I was falling. And the city, vast as it was, had narrowed to the width of my throat. By the time spring crept back into London, I was half wild, pacing the alleys like a rat that had lost its burrow. The bottle ruled every hour, every thought, every fragment of what remained of me. When it was full, I felt invincible, though invincible meant nothing more than being able to stagger upright and mumble through sentences. When it was empty, I dissolved into a shaking, sweating wreck. The old wisdom goes, chains need not be iron to bind. Mine was glass, corked, and amber, yet heavier than any shackle a jailer could forge. I drifted further from the places I once knew. The docks were closed to me, the lodging house on the verge of eviction, and even Mrs. Turner began locking her door against my knocking. I couldn't blame her. I reeked of sickness, of neglect, of desperation. She had given me kindness enough. I had squandered it. Sip by sip, London's oddities still reached me, though, scraps of absurdity clinging to my fog. Did you know that people once wore hats so tall they had to duck to pass through doorways? Imagine that, parading about like a candle on a stick, then stooping like a beggar to step indoors. The thought amused me for a moment, then twisted cruelly. At least those peacocks had roofs over their heads. My own was slipping away. One evening, after days of begging with little success, I found myself shuffling along Fleet Street, clutching my coat tight. My hands shook violently. I had only a few drops left. I tipped them into my mouth, and when the liquid was gone, I stared at the empty glass, horrified, as though it had betrayed me. Academics might call this the crisis point, that cold term for the place where body and soul collide with the inevitable. My body ached, my stomach churned, and every nerve screamed for relief. I staggered, cursed the cobblestones, and collapsed against a lamppost. The gaslight above flickered, casting me in and out of shadow like a lantern's cruel joke. A boy ran past, pointing at me, laughing. Drunkard. He didn't know the word for what I was. Perhaps there wasn't one. Not yet. I muttered aloud, though no one was listening. One more drop. My voice cracked on the words. I laughed bitterly at myself, then whimpered like a dog. For the first time, I wondered if death would be kinder than life with this hunger gnawing endlessly at me. But I wasn't dead yet, and as long as breath rattled in me, the bottle still called. Time stopped being a line and became a puddle. Days oozed into nights and nights folded over themselves like wet linen. I could stand in the same doorway and watch noon become dusk without noticing the change until somebody shouted at me for blocking the hall. The clock on the mantel became a cruel joke. Its hands kept saying the right numbers, but they looked like costume jewelry on a corpse. My watch, the one with a cracked face I'd pawned and then somehow bought back, was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. It told me the hour. Sure, but not the world I was supposed to live in. My senses split and multiplied. Sometimes I'd be folding a shirt and find my fingers counting pages I hadn't read. Other times I'd be staring at the street and hear music, faint, high and out of tune, like a violin trapped under floorboards. And I'd swear children were practicing scales in the cellar. Once I tapped on the floor and an old man looked up from his soup in the kitchen beneath us as if I'd interrupted his afternoon nap. He glared, then went back to his soup. I felt very British about the whole thing, embarrassed and unresolved. Sleep stopped being a refuge. Dreams grew long and knotted. A single corridor with doors that led to the same room, each door louder than the last. I'd open one and find a young me. Uncall used hands, hopeful face, then slam it shut because he was looking at me like a stranger. Other nights I was awake and the room kept on dreaming without me. Whispers under the blankets. A lullaby that wasn't familiar until I realized I hummed it as a child. I'd put my hand to my mouth as if to catch the sound and scare it into being real. That never worked. There were moments of clarity, Little islands of lucidity I'd cling to like someone grabbing your sleeve on a flooded street. In those islands I could taste coffee as coffee. Not as a delivery mechanism for oblivion. I could remember a neighbor's name. I could feel the steadiness of my hands. In those short hours I would write a sentence, a grocery list, fold a letter and think, this is the proof I'm still in the world. Then I'd wake and the sentences would be sand that blew away with the first gust of headiness. One time I wrote a perfectly reasonable note, asked Turner about Tuesday. It remained in my pocket for 3 days and then I found it as a confetti of ink after I tried to iron it. Small victories, small humiliations. Old timers have a saying, memory is a sieve. The good slips through while the trouble stays to rust. It's the kind of wisdom people say when they want to sound calm about losing things, in my case. The sieve had been turned inside out and was dumping everything important away. I'd catch myself asking the same questions twice across a single visit. Did you eat? Yes. Are you sure? Yes. Big, patient, kind people used a different tone on the third time. The tone you reserve for a clock that won't restart. It made me hate the sound of my own voice for being so repetitive. I began to stitch time together with patterns instead of facts. The maid's footsteps at 9. The carriage that rattled past twice in an hour. The way the sun hit the stained glass of the window at a certain slant. Patterns are cheating, but they are comforting. They pretend continuity where there is none. When pattern broke, when the maid came at the wrong hour or the carriage arrived twice, the house felt unmoored. And I would wobble like a ship at anchor. There were hallucinations that were almost tender. Once I sat in the parlor and had a long conversation with a woman who smelled of lavender and old stories. She spoke very quietly about seamstresses and the habit of knotting thread 3 times for luck. I wrote bits of what she said into a scrap. And later the scrap made sense to no one, the words meant nothing. She never blinked. People blink, right? People blink and then look embarrassed. Not her. I learned to test things. If she didn't blink, fade politely. If she did, ask her about the weather. The world reduced to a protocol for determining reality, which is perhaps the driest academic methodology you could ask for. The historiographical debate, if you want to sound like you mean business, would point out that personal time and social time diverge in addiction. The subject's experience becomes asynchronous with collective clocks. That's a big phrase to say. I was not on the same timetable as anyone else. If scholars like footnotes, they'd probably footnote my failure to keep appointments. I liked the idea that future professors would argue over whether I'd been ill or merely inconvenient. It felt like a legacy. The wrong kind, but a legacy nonetheless. On bad days the house grew loud with small things. The tick of a clock. The whisper of fabric. A radiator's sigh. Catcalls from the street melted into the creak of my bed. Faces pressed into the windows and then slid away. I'd sit very still, listening, waiting for the sound to reveal a pattern or an exit. Sometimes it did. Someone would call my name and I'd be able to answer. Sometimes it didn't and I'd fumble with the bottle as if it were the only map. There were 3 jokes I told myself to keep from crying. First, that if time was a puddle then I was happily splashing in it like a child. Then I looked at my hands and remembered children don't have these scars on their palms. Second, I told myself my diary would make a great comedy sketch someday. Man loses time. Wins sympathy. Third, I reassured myself that if anyone asked, I could blame the fog. Fog is a great scapegoat. Everyone else used it too. Each joke landed like a paper boat on the puddle and dissolved within minutes. But they buoyed me for a moment. Lucidity sometimes arrived as an almost scientific observation. I would notice the way the light changed on the wall, track it like a lab rat in its box, and say aloud, there it is again. Speaking the observation anchored me, as if naming a thing brought it under control. The nurse who visited once smiled at such sentences and called them good signs. The phrase felt bureaucratic and kind all at once, like a bandage with a company logo. I tried to measure the hallucinations. Some were old faces murmuring recipes. Others were strangers with impossible shoes. A man in the market tipped his hat and winked, and I thought a gentleman had found me worth speaking to. Turns out he had dropped a penny and was fishing for it. But I clung to the misread interaction like a lifeline. Small misreadings add up. Collect them like tokens and you can almost buy a memory back. At night the whispering began to crowd the bed. Not always words. Sometimes the feeling of being observed. A presence at the footboard like a cat sitting patient until you throw a tablecloth at it. I would throw the covers over my head and imagine I was a child again. Safe under a blanket. Under the blanket, time folded neatly into a tidy nap. When I emerged, the puddle had spread. The collapse of hours taught me grim arithmetic. Minutes are not neutral. They compound into weeks of forgetting. I would wake on a Tuesday and think it Wednesday. Then live a whole day on the assumption I had a meeting that didn't exist. When one of these phantom appointments involved money, rent due, coin owed, the reality hit like cold water. I began keeping little lists. In ink that bled and on paper that vanished. The lists became ghost towns. Names with no residents. In the end, the way time dissolved was not spectacular, it was domestic. It crept into my laundry and my letters. Into the way the maid stopped knocking. Time left traces. A dish unwashed. A seam not mended. A sentence never finished. Those traces are what remain when the clock stops meaning what it should. You cannot dramatize the domestic. You can only tell it until the listener yawns and the story slides into another puddle. The city had teeth, and by now it was chewing me slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the taste of ruin. When I walked through the streets, I felt not like a man among men but like refuse being carried along with the muck. My coat, once a modest shield, hung loose and ragged, its pockets bulging with nothing more than lint and the occasional coin scraped from pity. My shoes, too, had gone thin at the soles, and water seeped in as though to mock my every step. Old wisdom says, when a man is empty, even the wind weighs heavy. The wind of London carried coal smoke, the stench of horse droppings, and the clamor of hawkers shouting their wares. But for me, it carried only one sound, the hollow clink of an almost empty bottle knocking against itself inside my coat. Here's a quirky truth to break the heaviness. Londoners once believed carrots improved not only eyesight but also skin complexion. Parents would scold children, saying, "Eat your carrots or you'll turn pale as parchment." I almost laughed one night when I caught sight of my own reflection, cheeks hollow, skin yellowish, eyes sunken. A mountain of carrots could not have saved me then. I begged more openly now, crouching on corners with my hand out. Some tossed pennies, others curses. A gentleman in a fine hat sneered down at me, muttering, "Drunkard." I wanted to shout, "Not drunk, worse," but my tongue was heavy, and shame pressed harder than pride. I pocketed his penny, bought another sip, and sank deeper. The academics might describe this stage as social invisibility. The addict is not seen as sick, nor as criminal, but simply dismissed. Invisible. That word fit me too well. I could walk into a crowd, collapse to my knees, and the boots would part around me as if I were no more solid than smoke. One evening, wandering half frozen along the Thames, I thought I saw my father. He stood on the opposite bank, coat buttoned, hat straight, hands behind his back as he always carried them. He was watching me. I shouted, but the sound was swallowed by the river wind. When I blinked, he was gone. My chest ached, not only with longing but with fury. Fury that even in hallucination. He looked disappointed. I leaned over the water, the black surface rippling with gaslight, and thought of letting myself fall. But then the bottle in my pocket pressed against my ribs, and I gripped it like a talisman. I whispered, "Not yet, not yet." Death was patient. I could make it wait until the bottle was empty. So I turned from the river, shuffling back into the labyrinth of streets, carrying nothing but shadows and the certainty that I was running out of time, out of health, and most of all, out of excuses. They said it would be, for your health. That was the phrase, soft, neat, bureaucratic. I'd heard it 100 times from neighbors and doctors. A polite sentence designed to close conversations. The day they came for me, the doctor's voice was low and careful, as if he were reading the weather rather than announcing an exile. He placed a hand on my shoulder, light, clinical, and said, "A change of air, Mrs. Turner. Rest will do you good." The nurse who'd come with him smiled like someone offering tea with a limp biscuit. Her smile was practiced. It had never touched me before. Old wisdom whispers, when the house grows cold, go where warmth is promised. It sounded vaguely hopeful at the time. I believed it meant care. It meant someone would make the bed and fold the sheets with better hands than mine. It meant, perhaps, someone would ask what I wanted. I was wrong in every small way. The rest home, what they called the institution, was a tidy building with high windows and curtains sewn thick to keep the wind from gossiping through the rooms. They'd stitched the curtains so firmly shut that when you wanted to know whether it was noon or midnight, you had to ask them. They answered with a schedule. The carriage ride was a blur. The city shrank and the gates of the rest home opened like a mouth. A nurse in gray, hair tucked smooth as a bread crust, led me down a corridor that smelled of lavender and starch. The rooms were made to look like bedrooms, not wards. There were framed pictures of shepherds and sheep, pastoral domesticity as decor. The countryside sold by the square foot. The woman at the hearth stared into the flames with the sort of calm I'd once admired in a painting. I thought art could teach a lot, but apparently not how to unstick curtains. They unpacked my things. Someone else made the decisions about which dresses were tidy enough to keep, which scraps were flung into a trunk and sealed. A nurse folded fabric and hummed, the way one hums to stitch time into seams. She didn't pack the bottle. No one did. That absence was the first lesson. Autonomy can be removed as simply as a cork. I asked, "Where is it?" And the doctor, looking past me at a chart, said, "It's not part of the regimen here." He said it like a verdict. He didn't ask me if I wanted it. There's an old, dry saying for afternoons like that. Better a short misery with company than a long one alone. The phrase would have comforted me if the company had been kind. Instead, the staff strung protocols like rosary beads, meals at certain hours, walks at certain hours, rest at other hours. My days were arranged in neat boxes with labels: breakfast, rest, medication, exercise. I became a checkbox. The idea that care could be scheduled the way you schedule a carriage was quaint until it became the rule. I felt held, but in a ledger more than a hand. A quirky fact, because the world still offers absurdities when you need them, is that in those same years, people kept songbirds inside cages hung in public houses. They believed a singing canary made the ale taste better. I should have laughed then. A canary improving ale. It sounded as sensible as handing me a spoonful of new tonic and calling it medicine. The irony was thick, in a house full of humming routines. They thought music might fix what the bottle had broken. The staff struck a balance between kindness and strictness. A tightrope they walked to preserve the institution. Nurses were gentle when they measured the sheets, firm when they cut hair, brisk when they closed doors. They brought me warm broth as though pity had a temperature. They gave me tonics, chalky lozenges that stuck to my gums and herbal compresses that steamed like small clouds. And they exchanged prescriptions with a quiet efficiency that suggested the real business was not what healed but what was sold. My bottle's absence was never mentioned. Its removal was a quiet authorial edit to my life. The paperwork read, treatment initiated, patient stable, rest recommended. There's a phrase you'll hear in academic debates about medical ethics: therapeutic paternalism. It's the kind of jargon that makes institutions sound noble while hiding control. They used the rhetoric, sometimes, in meetings while I sat in a chair pretending to follow. It's a pragmatic phrase. Caregivers justify decisions by claiming to know better than the recipient. In plain English it meant, we decided for you. And they were right. In a way, they did decide. They decided I would be safe from my own hand, whether I liked it or not. The other women there were quiet and less prompted. They took their meals with small, polite nods. Some had been there longer than the rest of us had been alive. Their faces were maps of patience and old defeats. We shared small confessions in the laundry room, our secrets as pale as the linens. One woman told me, in a voice that scratched like an old needle, how she used to sell ribbons at the market and would pray every night for her husband's foot to be well. Another, a young girl with a shaved head, stared at me until I felt my private thoughts thin into public paper. We were companions by default. I tried to argue once, softly about the bottle, clumsily about being taken without a say. The doctor adjusted his spectacles, smiled the sort of smile you offer a child reciting a lesson, and said, "Time, miss, time will do what the bottle could not." He meant recovery. I heard eviction. It was a magnificent exercise in calm language masking finality. Humor survived in small ways. I made 3 little jokes to keep the room from tightening around my ribs. I told the nurse I'd move into the garden if she'd promised to water me every morning. She frowned. I said I'd start a club for men who lost their watches and their dignity. No one signed up, and I quipped that if the rest home sold memories by the ounce, I'd be bankrupt. The jokes landed like pennies in a fountain. No one expected them to ripple, but sometimes they did, and a nurse chuckled once. Briefly, like a gate opening. There were evenings when I would sit at the sealed window and listen. Outside, the city carried on, carriages, bells, laughter that belonged to other people. Inside, the night pulled the curtains tighter still. In the ward below, a woman called out for her mother in a voice thin and high. And the sound slid under the doors and woke something that had been sleeping in me, a persistent, quiet embarrassment. I thought of home, of narrow stairways, a kettle that never stopped boiling, of shouts down a hall that meant someone was alive, and I felt a wrongness that no tonic could straighten. Sometimes, when a nurse came to check my pulse and talked about the weather like a friend, I believed for a moment that I might be mended. Then the phrase, "continued observation," appeared in my chart and the nurse crossed her arms in that small, final way. My days became a ledger, notation after notation, a life footnoted. At night, the darkness under the curtains pooled like ink. Once, in a rare fit of defiance, I asked the nurse if I could keep one small thing from my trunk, my father's watch. Cracked glass and all. She hesitated, then said, "It's safer on the desk." The watch ticked there, small and foreign. It ticked like an office clock, recording me, not living me. In the end, the rest home taught me that care is sometimes a polite erasure. You're not simply helped, you're arranged. Your days are trimmed like hedges. Your desires pruned to suit the garden. The medicine changes hands without debate. The bottle, my private weapon, my private ruin, was gone. Taken away in a way that felt less like mercy than removal. I learned new rhythms, a cup at 8, a walk at 10, a pill at noon. I learned to be patient as a clock. But beneath the schedule, something like longing remained, a small, persistent ache that no tonic could name. The weeks folded over each other like pressed linens. Days lost their edges, and time in the rest home became less a line than a loop. Morning bells, measured footsteps in the hallway, the clatter of trays, the dull hush after supper, each day a copy of the last. Stamped with slightly different ink. If routine was meant to heal, it also dulled. The bottle, my once unruly companion, had been a tyrant, now the schedule was. The difference was that the bottle had been mine. There's an old saying, better the wolf you know than the shepherd who hides the path. The wolf takes what it wants, leaving no disguise. The shepherd, with gentle hands, can guide you anywhere, even into the ditch. I thought of this often as nurses smiled and steered us down corridors, as doctors nodded solemnly while withholding answers. Wolves had teeth, caretakers had clipboards. One afternoon, a nurse pressed a tonic into my hand, cloudy and thick as chalk water. I asked, "What is it?" She replied, Something to help you rest. It was neither a lie nor a truth. Something is a convenient answer when the question itself isn't welcome. I swallowed it anyway. Resistance would have been recorded as agitation. And agitation was treated with stronger somethings. You learned quickly which silences preserved peace. The institution prided itself on kindness. There were flowers in the courtyard. And once a month, a gramophone played waltzes for us in the common room. The irony bit deep. Music meant to rouse joy in hearts that had been quietly caged. Some women swayed gently, their faces pale but obedient, as if happiness itself were part of the regimen. I sat still, listening to the needle-scrape vinyl, thinking it sounded like time wearing itself down. Strange facts sometimes surfaced in my thoughts, uninvited but sharp. I remembered reading once that Roman aqueducts carried not only water but also whispers. Engineers discovered that voices could travel along the stone channels. Entire cities had their secrets seep into stone. I wondered if the rest home would carry our silence in its walls long after we were gone. Would some future ear press itself against plaster and hear the hush of women waiting for their names to be called? I became attuned to small rebellions. A woman tucked bread into her sleeve to eat later, defying the meal schedule. Another hummed under her breath during the prescribed, quiet hour. I once held a tonic in my mouth until the nurse left. Then spat it into the chamber pot. These were acts so tiny they barely qualified as resistance. Yet they sparked a fierce pride. To choose, even in secret, was to remain. The doctor visited weekly, his presence a ritual of authority. He never sat fully in a chair, always perched on its edge, as though his work demanded readiness to flee. He asked, "How are we feeling?" A plural question, as though my body were a committee. When I replied, "Better," he would nod without listening. "Already writing." When I said nothing, he nodded the same way. It wasn't answers he sought, but compliance. The phrase, "for your own good," floated through the halls like a draft. It excused everything: the locked cabinets, the barred gates, the confiscated letters, the missing bottle. For your own good. I wanted to shout that good, when forced, ceases to be good at all. It becomes order dressed as care. But shouting would only bring another tonic, and so I swallowed silence instead. At night, I dreamed of the bottle, not of drinking it, but of holding it, a small, glass certainty, heavy, familiar. In dreams, I uncorked it, not to pour, but to listen. Inside, instead of liquor, there was a low humming, like bees in a jar. I'd wake with the sound still in my ears, my hands empty. Humor clung to me, ragged but stubborn. Once, when the nurse measured my pulse, I asked, "Does it count as exercise if my heart's working harder than I am?" She blinked, then smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her. Another time, during a group walk, I said, "If we go any slower, we'll start moving backwards." A few women laughed, softly, like paper rustling. Humor was not forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged either. It threatened to remind us we were still human. The walls of the institution carried more than silence, they carried judgment. Visitors came rarely, and when they did, they spoke in lowered voices, as though madness were contagious. A neighbor once brought a basket of oranges and left it on the desk rather than place it in my hand. She whispered to the nurse, not to me. To be institutionalized was to become untouchable, even in the eyes of those who once shared your table. Still, there were moments of gentleness that slipped past the protocols. A nurse once brushed a strand of hair from my forehead with unexpected tenderness. Another smuggled me a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper, whispering, "Don't tell." On it, I wrote nothing grand, just my name, over and over, as though rehearsing ownership. To see it in my own hand was proof I hadn't dissolved entirely. They believed they had saved me from myself. Perhaps they had. The bottle was gone. The nights were sober, if not restful. My body, less poisoned, grew steadier. But my mind lived in the margin between obedience and defiance. always scanning for the seam where freedom might be stitched back in. The rest home taught me that survival wears many disguises. Sometimes it looks like submission. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it hides inside a joke no one laughs at. I had lost the bottle, but not the stubborn ember that burned beneath the routines. That ember whispered a single word: endure. And so I did. Day after day, sip after sip, silence after silence, I endured. But endurance, I learned, is not the same as living.